Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 16th, 2026, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, I want to start this episode by thanking those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. We are on episode number 593. I've been doing this since 2014, and I would not be able to keep making this show if it weren't for you, the amazing patrons. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download, and the way that I keep doing it week after week is by relying on the support of individuals just like you. If you'd like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you have to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Will Dufresne, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabo J., Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, and Joe Wilkinson. Thank you all so much. Okay, let's get into it. This week, I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Caroline Tracey about her new book, Salt Lakes, An Unnatural History. She is a science and nature writer whose work focuses on the environment, migration, and the arts in the American Southwest, Mexico, and their borderlands. She's written for all sorts of outlooks like The New Yorker, High Country News, New York Review of Books, and elsewhere. She's won a bunch of awards, and this is her debut book. Again, it's called Salt Lakes, An Unnatural History. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Caroline Tracey. Well, Caroline, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk about your new book, Salt Lakes, An Unnatural History. But before we get into the book itself and some of the interesting topics that you dive into, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you. So would you call yourself a geographer? Like, what is a person with a PhD in geography's title?
It is technically a geographer. My profession is not being a geographer necessarily, but I do think it is a good descriptor of the way I view the world and approach things. So I do use it, and I do have a graduate degree in it. So I feel like I've earned the right to call myself a geographer, even if my job isn't like, making maps.
Absolutely. I feel like if you did the work, like you get to own that for the rest of your life. You will always be a geographer. Yeah. But would you say you're spending most of your time now as a writer?
Yeah, I will call myself a geographer, or I'll say writer and geographer, but writer really is the title I tend to use.
And so do you prefer, as a writer, to stick with, obviously this is a full-length book, which is like every time I have somebody on who tackled a kind of science or academic topic in a full-length book, I'm always like, oh, how do you do it? You're so brave. But do you prefer to write in long form, or do you prefer shorter pieces, or do you just kind of run the gamut?
It's a good question because I feel like there are benefits to all three. When I was doing my doctorate in geography, I sometimes felt like the speed of academia was much too slow for me. I wanted to change topics more frequently than is really allowed. And so I became a journalist, in which I'm basically writing a new article every single week. And sometimes that feels way too quick. And so the book was really nice balance for me, even though it's a really long undertaking. I had so much creative control over what the different chapters did, and I was able to kind of, put it aside for a little while and then come back to it. And so I guess I like long form, but with a little more of an eclectic approach than, being a scholar.
Absolutely. And I feel like there's a lot of crossover from like looking at your book and looking at all of the incredible blurbs and all of the people who read an early copy and, gave props. Like so many of them have been on Talk Nerdy. So it's really fun that you're here with us today because I'm seeing Ben Goldfarb and I'm seeing Melissa Savani and I'm seeing Michelle Nyhouse and all these people that we've already featured on the show. So you're in good company here.
That's so fun. They're like, my forebears in this kind of writing. So I'm honored.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit, I mean, as a geographer, but also as writer and science writer, what drew you first to the topic of salt lakes? Like, I don't know. I mean, obviously, they affect all of our lives, and we'll get into that, but I don't know how many people listening to the show right now are like, I don't really even think about them. Maybe if you live near one.
Exactly. I was one of those people. I never thought about them. I guess I knew that Salt Lake City was a place that existed, but I grew up in Denver. It's very close to Utah, but like we would never go to Utah because we basically lived in a version of Utah. You know, we had our own mountains. We had our only city next to mountains. Utah was not a place I really thought about. And then when I was in my early 20s, I was dating someone who had grown up in California, and we ended up taking a bunch of road trips around Eastern California and Nevada. And that was a part of the American West that I was totally unfamiliar with. And so we went to the Salton Sea, we went to Owens Lake and Mono Lake, and Nevada, where you have the Basin and Range region. So basically every single valley in between mountains in Nevada is a closed valley with a salt lake at the bottom of it, all these tiny salt lakes that are dry most of the year. And I was just really taken with this landscape. It's really striking when you're driving to come upon these lakes because they're extraordinarily blue. Because they have the suspended minerals in them, they reflect really well. And so you see the sky and the mountains reflected in the lake in this really beautiful way. And I just was so shocked that these lakes would exist in this place in the desert, and then confused. Why are they there? And why do I keep finding more of them? And then that set me off on this journey.
I love that. And so maybe you can help us understand right at the beginning what exactly a salt lake is, because I heard you mention, they have all of these minerals suspended in them. So salt lakes aren't just lakes of salt, are they?
Yeah, the term salt really refers not only to just sodium chloride, what we would think of as table salt, but it's any of the minerals that are suspended. So some of the lakes do have mostly table salt suspended in them, like the Great Salt Lake, but some have higher concentrations of other minerals. But what I tend to describe salt lakes as are not by the amount of salts suspended in them. Scientists could tell you there's a certain threshold, but I think that there's so much variation within salt lakes that for me, what's an easier way to understand what they are is how they form geologically. And so basically, salt lakes are lakes that form at the base of a closed valley. So that means a valley that doesn't have an outlet where the water could flow out. And what happens is that the water from around the valley or the basin collects, and it doesn't have anywhere to go except to evaporate. And so when it evaporates, it leaves behind the minerals that are suspended in it. And that forms a lake over, geologic time. So many of these salt lakes are the remnants of much larger Pleistocene era lakes or inland seas. And so we're just seeing the sort of modern day remnants of those. And then they do have this kind of influx of fresh water each year that brings with it a small amount of minerals too.
Okay, so that is fascinating because I'm probably not the only one here who just kind of assumed that but now that I think about it, it's like, what was I thinking? The salt lakes that I know about are really far inland, but like, who just kind of assumed that salt lakes are formed kind of the way that, like, what are they called? Oxbow lakes are formed, where it's like that's like a piece of a river or something that gets pinched off. But why did I assume that it was like ocean water?
I mean, I guess in one moment in geologic time, some of them were ocean water,
like really far back. Yeah.
Nowadays, their inflows are fresh water, and so sometimes, I mean, you'll hear with these salt lakes that are kind of drying up, like the Great Salt Lake or the Salton Sea, you'll hear the idea of, we could build a pipeline from the ocean, but actually that wouldn't really help because the ecosystem relies on fresh water refilling the lake each year, not salt water.
Yeah. I'm curious about some of these like lagoons. I was just looking it up. I visited the Blue Lagoon in Iceland recently, which has this like really interesting mineral content, and the water's like baby blue, but it's geothermal. And I was would that be considered a salt lake, or is that sort of like a completely different process?
That's a good question. I'm not specifically sure about those thermal
Hmm.
lagoons. I will say like the Salton Sea, for instance, has a lot of geothermal activity around it. Actually,
Hmm.
there's like a geothermal. There are geothermal plants right around it. So that has to do with the fact that it is on a fault line.
Right.
So it's almost like a separate. It's almost like a maybe some scientists will listen and tell me I'm wrong, that I'm about to say it's a coincidence. But my understanding is, there's this one geologic process that sort of created the Salton Sea there, and then there happens to be also a fault line running through it that creates all kinds of geothermal activity. But I will add also that in Spanish, and I think in Portuguese too, they use the word laguna to refer
Mm-hmm.
to any type of water body that has only one inflow or outflow. So a salt lake, an inland salt lake in Spanish is a laguna. There's the Laguna Salada, which is like basically the Salton Sea, but on the Mexican side. And it's a
Interesting.
laguna, but then also you have coastal lagunas because it's just a place where the ocean enters, but doesn't really have a separate exit.
Yeah, which we have. Obviously, I live in Southern California, and so we've got even places named Laguna Beach, right? So
Yeah.
for that very phenomenon. And of course, the Salton Sea is somewhat nearby. I've actually never visited it, but I've always been really fascinated by the Salton Sea, both from a, I guess you could say, scientific, historical, geographical perspective, but also just from a cultural perspective as well. So maybe for folks who don't know, because they're not, over on this part of the country, what do you like? What did you dig into about the Salton Sea? Because you did mention it a couple times.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's one that, I think many people have heard of Great Salt Lake because it's the name of a major city. But the other lake that often people have heard of that I wrote about in this book is the Salton Sea because it holds this very strong allure, especially for Californians, I think. The Salton Sea was created essentially by accident in 1905 when the early settlers to what is now the Imperial Valley built very quickly an irrigation canal to divert water from the Colorado River into the area they wanted to farm.
Mm.
Um, and that year, the Colorado River had an enormous, sort of well above average snowpack, and came flooding down and accidentally diverted its entire course into this irrigation canal that they built. And
Whoops.
so it wiped out everything they had built, all the railroad tracks, all the telephone poles, and it filled up a basin, which it's not that it had never filled up before. It was a basin that was kind of part of the region that had a historic lake called Lake Cahuila, but it wasn't something that had a lake, permanently. And so it filled up, and then the lake continued to be filled year after year by flood irrigation from the Imperial Valley. So every year the farmers, would flood their fields to water their crops, and that water would run off into the lowest point of the valley, which is where the Salton Sea had also settled. Um,
Hmm.
and there, there's a thing called secondary salinity, which is where in desert regions that haven't had a lot of rainfall, the soils are full of salt. And so when they would irrigate their fields, it would bring those salts in the soil to the surface, and they'd have to flood irrigate them again to get that salt to go away. So there was
Mm.
2 rounds of water going into the Salton Sea every year, and it made it pretty big for a long time. And it developed this kind of tourism industry, very popular with people from LA. And then the lake started to dry up. Well, first, I would say I think it started to scare people off because it was filled with fish. And then when it gets really hot in the Imperial Valley, the fish would all die off and it would smell very bad.
Yeah.
Then, just about 20 years ago, there was a deal between the Imperial Irrigation District, the farmers of the Imperial Valley, and the city of San Diego to sell a large proportion of their water rights to the city of San Diego for drinking water. And so after that point, much less water was going into the Salton Sea. And so it's been drying up pretty fast. When you go there now, I write in the book about visiting in 2014 and how the beach at that point was fish bones, and from all the fish dying off because of the hot temperatures. But now when you go, you do find those fish bones, but they're pretty far from the water's edge. You have to walk through this kind of former lake bed that's just like gray, soft soil to get to the water's edge. It's pretty noticeable. And in that time, because it was this place where this tourist industry was abandoned, these other communities started to spring up. So now I think there's, people know the Salton Sea because nearby is Salvation Mountain, this mural that one man kind of dedicated his life to painting, Slab City and Bombay Beach, these towns that have kind of developed an allure for people because they're these sort of isolated, unusual places. And so the Salton Sea has layers of interest.
Oh, it's fascinating. Does it still smell horrible down there?
It smells, I think now there are no fish. So now it's not smelling because of the fish die-offs, because it's too saline now for fish to survive. But there are chemical reactions that are related to the fertilizers that are dissolved in the water and that kind of thing. So it does definitely have smells at certain times.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating thinking about, it's fascinating thinking about both aspects. And I love that that's how you approached your writing as well. Like, you thought about geologic, time scale, but you also thought about what we're doing right now to the landscape and how incredibly quickly human activity is shifting things. And then, of course, you shared, your own personal story as you were researching and visiting these areas. And I want to kind of touch base, if we have enough time, on all three of those things. And I'm not sure what you feel most comfortable digging into first, but I have to say, one reason that my kind of ears perked up, my eyes perked up, I don't even know, when your book crossed my desk, is because A, we haven't talked about these phenomena on the show before, and B, like, I grew up Mormon. I didn't grow up in Salt Lake City. I grew up in Texas, but it was anybody who has ever lived their life in the Mormon community, it's your whole life. Like, it's such a massive portion of your identity. Of course, I left when I was very young. I'm no longer a believer, but I love that you learned about Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake, via kind of like Mormon history and genealogy and stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, actually, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah, please.
I'm curious what, growing up in the Mormon church, what was your sort of perception of environmentalism or concern for the environment?
I did not notice any of that. I mean, I will say, again, I didn't grow up there. I grew up in Texas, so I kind of grew up in oil country, where it's very, very conservative. And I did leave the church when I was quite young. I was 14, 15. But my family is still fully Mormon. I left, they didn't, which was a whole thing, which I've talked about on other shows. But no, I don't remember there being a lot of conversations about that, but I also don't remember an anti-environmentalist bent either. I just remember neutrality. I just didn't really hear people talk about it when I was a kid.
Yeah. That was something that really interested me in the research I did for the book, was to, talking with Mormon environmentalists about the sort of synergy they saw between the church and environmentalism, but I definitely got the sense that they felt somewhat isolated in that interest and that effort.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I could definitely see. I mean, one thing that I will say about my experience in the Mormon church is that for all of the problems that I could list with it, it was probably because culturally it is a more middle class existence, or at least it was in the 80s and 90s when I was younger. There was a real emphasis on education. There was a real emphasis on knowledge and in some ways on kind of stewardship, maybe more of the country than of the globe. But there definitely was a lot of emphasis on having a relationship with your home. And of course, history and the history of the West. I mean, that was a huge part of the church because, they moved west to settle. And we can, again, this podcast is not about the reasons why and all the problems with them, but goodness, did they have a lot of probably really rich descriptions of the landscape.
Exactly. Yeah, that was part of what drew me to doing that research like I mentioned, I grew up in Denver. And so I had this sort of environmentalist culture that I was surrounded by from growing up there. And it was really interesting to me to learn that in Salt Lake City, that sort of relationship to the land had a religious element to it. And that there were people who had sort of approached it as part of, scripture and belief. And so I was, interested to learn about the relationship to land from that perspective.
And so what kinds of insights did you gain? I mean, did you find that some of this sort of outsider science, as it were, was just as rich as some of the documentation of, kind of, I guess, what you would consider to be like learned explorers? Or were there insights that were offered by the sort of Mormon literature that maybe we wouldn't have if we didn't have that literature?
That's a good question. I think that, when I was starting the interviews that I did, the word stewardship that you just mentioned came up a lot. I think that, that's a big sort of key word in Mormon culture is the impression I got. Just in stewardship at every sort of scale, right? Of your home, of your community, and then of the planet, right? And so with that comes a degree of thrift and not using more resources than you need. And some people told me that historically a lot of Mormons had been vegetarians because of those principles. And so that's kind of where it started, was these sort of daily life practices. And then from there, I got really interested in sort of the history of irrigation, because another reputation that Mormons have, at least in the West and maybe nationally, is they are irrigators. They're like beavers. Like that's like a thing that people say.
Oh, they like beavers too. Yeah, exactly. That's like there's like bees and there's beavers and there's like certain animals that they like celebrate in the church.
Yeah, it's like the Mormons are obsessed with building dams. Like what is up? Anyway, so I wanted to understand that history. Like why does this community that is a faith community have this reputation for being obsessed with engineering? And so I started to read about why that was and what the history of it was. And what I was interested to learn was that it came out of really practicality, right? That if you're going to settle in the American West, you need to move water from the rivers to your fields because it's not going to rain enough to grow crops. So it was born out of necessity, but it was, of course, organized in the same structure as the church oversight. And so it became really melded with the faith community. And I think from there, the irrigation, took on this. It took on a big significance, and then interesting. What I was sort of most surprised to find out was that the Mormon sort of oversight of its irrigation works ends up becoming part of the basis of Western water law.
Wow. Oh, that is fascinating. And I mean, in a way, it kind of doesn't surprise me because definitely when I think about the history of the church that I was privy to as a woman, as a young woman, it definitely did seem like just for whatever reason, people who found themselves in this religion, especially early on, were also just like very industrious and very politically motivated. And so being involved in, obviously, like there's an entire city and beyond that is like deeply enmeshed with the church, but there's so many Mormon individuals in politics, in government, in these different areas. And especially when it comes, like you mentioned, to like infrastructure and municipal projects. I mean, my dad's an engineer. He's a Mormon engineer. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there's a book, Cadillac Desert. It's sort of a famous book about water in the West and he says, he has this line that I just really have not been able to corroborate, but it doesn't strike me as terribly far-fetched. I just don't know how far-fetched it is, where he says, like, the Bureau of Reclamation, the government dam building agency, he says it was primarily staffed by Mormons. And it's, I mean, I haven't been able to really fact check that, but it would make sense that the federal government was looking at Utah as the place to learn how to do what they wanted to do.
And so, how have their sort of policies? I mean, I know it's like probably really complex because we've got this interplay of like both stewardship, but also kind of exploitation and colonialism and manifest destiny and all of these things. But I'm curious, over time, how has the Great Salt Lake been managed, and how is it actually faring?
Yeah, it's a great question. The major problem facing salt lakes, in addition to climate change, which has kind of made everything worse, but for decades, the issue has been that the water that we use in arid regions, because salt lakes mainly are found in arid regions, um, is diverted before it gets to these lakes, which are at the end, the end point of the rivers, because they're at the bottom of the valleys. And
Hmm.
so along the river's course, there are many points of diversion for irrigation work. So this is true in Utah, but not only in Utah, of course. It's true in Colorado, it's true in Arizona, it's true in California, that the water is diverted on its way to these lakes. And the amount that the water is diverted has to do with the kind of concepts that undergird water law. So there's an idea called beneficial use, which is you need to put the water that you are allowed to use to use. You shouldn't waste it. Waste is the opposite of beneficial use. And then there's this idea of prior appropriation, which is first in time, first in right. So prior appropriation sort of gives you the list of who gets the first water right, second water right, third water right. And beneficial use says you can divert as much as you can use, but you can't divert more than you can use. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the one that came from, Brigham Young and Utah. But when they come together, they mean that there's you can't basically leave any water in the stream because that is waste. That's wasting the water. You're not putting it to beneficial use. You need to put it to the
Fascinating.
next person in the list of prior appropriation. And
Right.
so that has led to this situation now where the rivers are all over appropriated because the goal is to sort of not leave water unused. And
Hmm.
that's a problem for lakes, because for these terminal lakes, I mean, lakes at the bottom of closed basins, because no water or very little water, much less than they need, reaches them. So the problems that creates are primarily having to do with the ecosystem first, where the creatures that live in these lakes require a certain amount of salinity. Just because they can live at high salinities relative to most of nature doesn't mean they can live at extreme salinities.
Right.
And that also, as the lake shrinks, it's creating a problem for humans of dust storms.
Oh, okay. So sort of the soil that is exposed, is that what is kind of the foundation of the dust storms?
Exactly. So, like soil, I mean, it's not that you don't have dust storms from an exposed bare ground area of the earth, but the soil, the lake bed is much looser. It hasn't been compacted over years in the same way
Mm,
that the ordinary earth surface has, and so it's very emissive.
right. There's no plants grown into it. There's no root structure. It's just loose dirt. Oh, wow.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. And we mentioned climate change kind of in passing, and I understand why we always do this because it's like such a huge issue, and like we all sort of get it to some extent. But ultimately, I've always been confused about this. So, the water cycle, like the globe is a system. It's a full system, and there's only so much water on the planet, right? And the water evaporates and it recondenses and it rains and it does all these really interesting things and it seeps into the ground. But when we are extracting, and then you add to that the planet is getting hotter and hotter and hotter, which means more and more evaporation. A, how does that affect these lakes? And B, how does that then kind of feed back on itself in the whole system?
Yeah, that's a good question. And my understanding of it is, yes, like there's somehow this amount of water that like stays static in the earth. It's so
Hmm.
confusing. But what I think is happening is that in these closed basin systems, so if you picture, picture Salt Lake City with the mountains around it. There's less water in the system. There's less water. There's less snow falling on those mountains every year. So there's less water to begin with. And then the other factor is that when the water is diverted onto irrigated fields. So when you take that water out of the river and then you're using it to water plants, a lot of that water is evaporating back into the atmosphere, and it's generally falling as rain on wetter systems, on like areas that are more likely to get rained on.
Right.
And so
just because the system is huge, like it doesn't mean that it's homogeneous, right?
Exactly.
It's
like
very
it's not like that
heterogeneous.
water is like evaporating, coming right back down onto the same mountains. It's not like a closed loop like that. It's going into the atmosphere and it's falling in the places it's more likely to fall. And it's contributing to sea level rise because it's sort of like all the irrigated agriculture and the evaporation from it ends up moving water into these wetter regions.
Oh, that's fascinating. And so are we seeing that sort of across the globe? Because obviously we've described, American salt lakes so far. We are American. We both live in sort of the southwest region of America. But there are obviously salt lakes all over the world, right? So are all salt lakes evaporating?
The vast majority, yes. And there are examples all over the world. So another example that maybe listeners will be familiar with is the Aral Sea, which is in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. That was once the world's fourth largest lake and is now like less than a tenth of its original size, largely because the rivers that fed it were diverted to help the Soviet cotton industry. So those rivers were not reaching the sea for years, and the sea essentially dried up as a result. And you've seen the same things on a bigger scale as the Great Salt Lake or the Salton Sea, where you have massive dust storms, health effects because the waters that were reaching the lake had fertilizer and chemicals, pesticides in them, and so the dust has the residues of those.
That's fascinating. Is there something about lakes being really, really big and also being salty? I guess I'm looking it up, and of course, all of the lakes, the Great Lakes, are not salt lakes; they're freshwater lakes. But like, I don't know, the Caspian Sea, the Dead Sea, the Salt Lake, the Aral Sea, like those are all salty, right?
The Caspian Sea is a salt lake, yeah, and it is shrinking actually.
God, that's rough. Is the Dead Sea like different? Because I mean, I know it was different because I visited it and I spent time in it, and I was like, "Ow, my body is tingling," because it is very salty, and you can like cut yourself on all the jagged salt on the shores. But is that a different type of salt lake? I mean, it's very famously salty.
Yes. I don't have a chapter about the Dead Sea. I didn't research it for this book, but I have heard the same thing from other people about how much it makes your body hurt, which, in my experience, the Great Salt Lake doesn't do that quite so much. Yeah. I think it is a salt lake like these others, but I think it has a significantly higher salt concentration.
Oh yeah, I just looked it up. Geez, it's 9 times saltier than the ocean. So it's hypersaline.
Yes,
hypersaline.
That's
fascinating. Yeah, so then you can like sell the salt water for all this money and be all pseudoscientific about it. But I will say it was fun because you just float. You just very easily float. But if you have an unknown cut on your body, you will discover it when you walk into the Dead Sea.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, no, yes. I feel like I live with dry skin. I feel like I would just suffer.
You got to go. It's fascinating. I was able to go a couple years ago when I was visiting Jordan, and I really enjoyed it. So, we've talked about sort of a medium level, a more macro level, but you also get micro. And I think my favorite books, the ones that feel to me, at least in the nonfiction genre, the most literary and the ones that are the most page turners, are memoirs where there's vulnerability in the author and where there is a lot of kind of personal conversation. And so I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about your own personal journey and your decision to use I and to reflect on that journey in the book. So tell me about, before we even get into kind of your story, tell me what drove you. Was it a hard decision? Did you know you were going to do that from the beginning?
I would say it was almost the reverse. It was me writing this I kind of narrative about my life experiences in this kind of essayistic mode and realizing that Salt Lakes, was a thing I was interested in and slowly orienting the book more toward research from being
Oh,
more
cool.
essayistic. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. So then you were able to kind of blend almost these two parallel tracks and bring them together.
Yeah, I mean, I had been visiting Salt Lakes. I had been writing about those experiences, but I realized I wanted to also research and report about them.
Yeah. So tell me then about sort of the personal narrative that you chose to include in the book. Like how did you decide what you wanted to talk about and how deep you wanted to get?
Yeah, I think that it was always going to be a book that had a personal narrative because I was writing it, partially in order to kind of figure things out for myself. And
Mm,
one of the things I was trying to understand, or maybe the principal thing I was trying to understand, was I wanted a sense of home. I was in my 20s, and so I felt like adrift, and I didn't understand, how do you find a sense of home in the world, and especially in a world where I'm constantly bombarded with information about the horrors of climate change, the
mm,
the degree to which the region that I have grown up in, which is the American West, has changed, is going to change further. How am I supposed to feel at home in that kind of setting situation? And so the personal narrative follows me sort of on that conceptual journey, and one of the big kind of elements of that is a kind of queer coming of age journey, in which
mm.
at the beginning of the book, my early road trips through the Salt Lakes were with my college boyfriend, who, as I mentioned, was from California, and then toward the end of the book, I end up getting married to the person who's still my wife, my current wife, who is from Mexico City, which was built on a salt lake. So that has its own Salt Lake narrative there. But I think, the promotional materials for the book describe it as kind of like an exploration of my own identity, and I would say I don't necessarily want to negate that, but I think I see it as kind of part of this search of, well, what is a sense of home in today's world, and what kind of life do I want to live?
I love that. And I think it also is, not to politicize your own life, because that would be a pretty effed up thing to do. But like, I guess as I've been, on my own journey and spending more time with the people that I love. And uh, I'm just learning more and more that, we have the classic coming of age stories. We have the classic coming out stories. I think everybody right now is like real excited about Heated Rivalry. And
Yes.
like there are all these like really kind of hopeful and like hard, but like, I mean, that's why we love Heated Rivalry, because it's kind of like, oh, that's how it should have always gone. But I think there are more and more, and I don't know, maybe this isn't a fair thing to say, the exploration of sort of not just queer identity, but queer societal, I guess, new normativity, I think is so exciting that, I think for a long time, people had to fight to be gay. They had to fight for it to be okay to be gay. And that's still the case. But we have a new generation of people who are fighting just to love who they love. And I think
Yeah,
there's something really meaningful in that.
definitely. Yeah, I mean, I also really enjoyed Heated Rivalry and watched the whole thing multiple times. But I think it actually has really something very cool narratively going on that resonated with me, having written this book, where a lot of the queer media that I consume, because I also have watched all the other like queer coming of age teen dramas and stuff,
Hmm.
um, is that often the endpoint is making this sort of coming out pronouncement. And
Hmm.
I had always watched this media being like, why can't you just not tell anyone for 10 years and just live your life and have a great time? And, or like specifically not tell your parents, right? Like the teen dramas, they're always the like season finales coming out to their parents. And I'm like,
right.
why?
When they're like 17 and it's like, that is just not most people's experience. Some people, yes, but not most people.
So I loved seeing this like representation on TV of just like having sex with someone for 10 years and not telling anyone, because I thought that is a queer narrative that just exists a lot in the world and was not on TV. And so I really appreciated that. But yeah, I think that, you know, my sort of journey toward queerness had as much to do with things like going to friends' houses, you know, queer friends' houses. I describe this in the book, and sort of feeling like this is so different than my, like, you know, newly married straight friends' houses in a way I can't totally put my finger on. Like, what does that mean? What is the sort of, what am I feeling here? And then even as I sort of spent time with queer friends that were a little older than me, sort of being like, wow, like the sort of rhythm of life is different and the values are slightly different. And it just sort of felt like, oh, I feel more at home. Again, back to the sort of where do I find a home question of like, I feel more at home in this rhythm and this house and this sort of style of life.
Yeah. Yeah. I've definitely found that too. The older that I get, and like whether I'm talking about, you know, being on the apps, you know, when that was a thing, or it's still a huge thing, or spending time with other people, or, you know, dating one person or dating multiple people, that the more I think that there, at least in my experience, that there's a queer identity, the more there's like a shorthand, the less there that you have to kind of explain yourself, the more kind of that there's this feeling of acceptance really early on. And I don't know, it takes me back to my experiences sometimes when I was very young. And even though I wasn't lucky enough to, I think, find a queer community when I was young, growing up in Texas and being Mormon, I think I always was able to find sort of an alternative community, like a punk rock community. And it felt more like home, because it was like, you just be you. Like we like you regardless of how weird you are.
Yeah, exactly.
And I loved that, you know, and I love that we're living in a world now. I think like young people are teaching us an awful lot about identity, and about, you know, some people, the label is meaningful, and it is a way to be able to feel ourselves when we never quite could before. But for other people, a label is just really, really constraining and constricting. And what a cool thing that so many kids now are just like, I don't know, I love who I love. I'm attracted to who I'm attracted to. I don't even think about those kinds of things. It's beautiful. And so I love, too, that the Salt Lakes have been there for you. I mean, tell me, what do you expect then for your future? What is your relationship going to be? And God, I hope they're still around, you know, as we grow old.
Yeah, I mean, there's almost this sort of like mystery element to the book, an unsolved mystery element of will we save the lakes? Because there are a number of options on the table of political changes that would be really beneficial. And I don't know if you saw this past weekend, Trump was tweeting, or not, it's not even tweeting, it's Truth Social or whatever this new platform that he uses is called. But he was, he like posted on that platform, like, make the Great Salt Lake great again. Trump, for some reason, has gotten interested in the Great Salt Lake. So
oh gosh, that almost makes me more worried. Like, I'm like, can you just ignore it? That would be more helpful. I feel like let the adults come up with the policy.
I know. I'm like, what is going to where is this going to lead?
Yeah.
But yeah, apparently Utah is going to like provide him with a possible plan. Yeah, so that's, you know, there just are sort of multiple political cliffhangers at the moment. There's also the phalarope, the Wilson's phalarope, which I write about in the second to last chapter of the book, which is the only bird that migrates the entire length of the American hemisphere only via Salt Lake. So it goes from Canada to Argentina, flying between Salt Lakes.
Wow.
Recently received the petitioners received notice that it is going to advance to a full review for being listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And if that happens, that's another thing that would trigger an enormous amount of protections for salt lakes. There are also, really in the weeds changes happening to water law across the American West, but that could have pretty substantial impacts on salt lakes. So there's all kinds of stuff that could happen politically, but we really don't know what is going to happen and whether it's going to happen. And so I think it does sort of leave me still with a bit of the question of how do you find a home, right? That the sort of the country that surrounds you still remains changing.
Absolutely. And so for the listeners, kind of back to the very first thing I mentioned and your experience before your eyes were open to salt lakes. For the listeners who are like, I've never even thought about a salt lake. I don't know if I've ever seen one before. I don't know if I've ever spent any time around one. Do you think that there is something to be said about encouraging visiting, learning more? Obviously, reading the book, you're going to learn a lot more, but having a personal experience with these kind of geologic wonders, first of all, but also these really rich ecosystems. Like, should we all visit a salt lake at least once in our life?
I would say absolutely. There's probably no harm that can come from it. But I think that the book is about my decade-long exploration to attachment to these lakes. And I want to not only encourage people to become equally obsessed with salt lakes, which is totally fine if that's the outcome, I would be very happy, but also to sort of alert people to the fact that there are all kinds of underappreciated and threatened ecosystems around us that are sort of surviving against the odds and that have all kinds of unusual life forms and geology that you can just learn about. You can whether you're near a salt lake or whether you're in a totally different ecosystem, you can find something around you that merits the same amount of interest and affection and that you can learn similar things from.
Oh, I love that. Find your own salt lake and nerd out on it and become obsessed with it. And maybe you can A, have a more fulfilled life and B, like make a big difference for the planet. But it doesn't have to be a salt lake, whatever your own version of that is. That's great advice.
Thank you.
Well, gosh, I've got to thank you so much for being here with us today, for obviously, putting your heart and soul into this book, for sharing it with us. It's been a really interesting conversation and definitely sort of like whetted my appetite to learn more about this part of our home that, I like you before this, like didn't really think much about. So thanks so much for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me, for the invitation and for your interest.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.